Hello folks, welcome to the canal channel Jose. Today we're gonna show you if your alternator is charging or not charging with the simple steps you can do at home. And with that, this is your component that keeps the power into your car while the engine is running. And if this guy is not doing his job, your battery can go bad, and then you can end up in the side of the road. So we're gonna show you how to check if this is charging correctly and if it's even charging your system. So for this test on how to diagnose if your alternator is charging or not charging, we're going to start up our vehicle. Due to these new vehicles working on electronics and requiring power to power up the fuel pump, if the fuel pump doesn't get any power, it's going to stop working, so the fuel is going to stop going to the engine. So there's two sources of power on these vehicles, is a battery and your alternator charging your battery. But if your alternator stops charging and you still going with the battery and your battery dies out and you change the battery and then it happens again, you can do the simple test of verifying if your alternator is working. So what we're gonna do is, this vehicle has we're gonna show you what happens when the alternator is not charging. So when we disconnect the battery, the engine is going to shut down because there's no source of power. And we said that there's two sources of power, alternator and battery. If the alternator stops charging, your battery dies down and it stops providing power, then your car is going to shut down. So we're going to show you how to verify the alternator is not charging. So at this point, folks, we're going to disconnect our battery, and if the battery is providing the power to the engine, it's going to tell us if the alternator is bad, because all the power should be coming from the alternator once we disconnect the battery. And we're gonna see what happens once we disconnect the battery. Okay folks, so we're gonna connect our terminal back to the battery, and we're gonna see what happens once we turn on the engine again and we disconnect it, and see for the second time what happens to the engine when we disconnect that terminal. So we connect it. Now we turn on our engine again. So now we're gonna disconnect our battery, and we're gonna see what happens to the engine with no power from the battery and no power for the alternator. And this is gonna diagnose that the alternator is not charging. So this is a simple way to diagnose a bad alternator by disconnecting a terminal from the battery. And if the engine shuts down, that means that there's no power being provided from the alternator to the engine when it was canceled from the battery. So that means that they're bad alternator. The alternator should be able to keep up the demand of the fuel pump on the basic electronics to keep the engine running. But if the alternator is not charging at all, you could have a bad alternator, or you could have a bad belt which is not even spinning. So that's why I wanted to show you how to diagnose a bad alternator in a car without taking it to a shop. You could do this at home for yourself. And now we're going to show you with a multimeter the readings on the battery while the engine is running and everything's connected. If the readings are low, that means the alternator is not providing power to the battery. But if the alternator was working fine, the reading should be above 13.0 volts to the battery. But for that, let's show you how it's done. So now folks, we're gonna show you that this battery is not charging even when the engine running and connected to the terminals. So we got the volts, and we got 12.16. For this battery to charge, it should be over 13.5. It should be 13.8 to 14 volts on the charging system, but it's showing 12.16, and it's actually dropping 12.15 as we can see. So this battery is actually draining right now instead of charging. So the alternator is not, the charging system is not doing its job. So we are dropping. Now let's check again and see what's the reading. It's actually 12.04 is dropping actually. So it's not even charging. Instead of charging, it's dropping. So we had a 12.16 earlier, over 10, and now it's at 12.04 on the voltage. So now we're gonna disconnect the terminal again and see what happens. and it turns off because the alternator is not charging. So now folks, we have replaced our alternator. We have that truck running. So we're gonna show you what happens now with a new alternator once we unplug the battery. What happens to the engine when it's not plugged into the battery. So at this point, before the truck would shut down, let's see what happens now with a new alternator. So before we disconnected the terminal and then the truck would shut down. So now we're gonna disconnect it again and show you what happens with the new alternator. If the alternator is working properly, it's gonna keep the demand of power to the engine to stay on, and if it doesn't do that, then the truck will shut down. So let's disconnect it. So we have disconnected our terminal. So now the truck is being fed by the alternator, which is providing just enough power to keep the engine running. We connect it again, and the truck keeps operating normal. Let's see what's the voltage at this point with a new alternator on the truck. It's giving us 13.64. So the alternator is charging the system down to almost zero, 13.64. So the alternator is charging. And well folks, and this was a easy way to test an alternator when it's not charging, and you can do this at home. And we did it by disconnecting a terminal from the battery. And if you think that your alternator is not charging your battery, what you can do is you can just disconnect the negative part of the battery, and if the engine shuts down, that means your alternator is not charging. But that doesn't mean the alternator could be the reason. There's so many other things that can go with it. It could be a fuse, it could be a bad belt that is broken belt, or a wire that is not connected. So start by the cheapest one. Check your belt. If the belt is physically there, then go check your fuses, and if the fuses are all okay, then start tracing your wires and see if there's any broken wires or disconnected. So with that said, if you did all that and it looks good, then you can take your alternator off and take it to auto parts, and they can most of the auto parts can test it for free and see if it's working or if it passed or failed the test. So with that said folks, I hope you have enjoyed this video and you find some of this info useful towards your new project, and we'll see you soon with more videos here in el canal El Chano Jose.